the big influencing factor was behavior, but we don't talk about behavior, do we? So through all of those experiences, what I thought we needed was a really good way to have engaging, constructive conversations about behavior. And how do we do that? We can't take it straight on and it's like me, okay, Gavin, back to my office. I want to talk to you about your behavior. That's really, that whole conversation is stopped even before it starts. But what if I said, we use a bit of creative metaphor, a bit of humor, a bit of fun, have structured conversation and say, well, hey, Gavin, why don't we grab a coffee, go down to the cafe and have a bit of a talk about the animals in the zoo. And, some people say, oh, that's so politically incorrect. You can't call people animals or whatever. I go, no, I'm not calling people animals. We're using animal characters to represent behaviors. And a person has many different behaviors, and that behavior changes with context. So, when you're dealing in, everything's going really well, there's no problem, you can behave in one way, but, when something like a crisis, like a COVID or some sort of pandemic or, the building's on fire, you need to change your behavior. You can't just keep behaving in the same way that you were before because it's not going to give you the outcomes. So that's where the organizational zoo came from. I did a lot of study. I'd already created the organizational zoo before I did the PhD. And then I went back, and what I wanted to do was to give the whole sort of creative metaphor some credibility, because we use metaphors all the time. A metaphor is just, representing something in a creative way so that you can simplify the meaning. So, if I said to you, sort of chauvinist pig, that one is no longer sort of used because it's kind of politically incorrect, but people know what you're talking about. Some metaphors work really well and others can be quite confusing depending on cultural context. So we needed to create a thing that represented a whole range of different behaviors that could be fairly universally understood, even though the interpretation may be a bit different. Like, for example, if I said to you, the boss was behaving like a lion. Anyone on the call? What would I mean? Just a word, a couple of words.
Courageous.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you. Definitely
Male.
Courageous. Yep.
It would be a man, most likely. I don't think you'd describe a woman as being a lion.
Yeah, well, not normally, unless I get home late after I've been heavily drinking or something, there may be some lion behavior being displayed, right? And of course, the lion behavior in this context, it's the male lion that we're talking about representing the behavior, which is this, courageous control and command. In Asia, that's respected. And if you look around, buildings in Singapore and China and other places, they've even got lions as a protector at the front door. Singapore is known as the Lion City. So in a hierarchical, control respecting environment, that behavior of control and command is respected. But, people like your kids, my kids, my kids are 30, kids, my young adults are 30 years old. When there's control and command behavior going on, it's micromanagement. It's how dare this old grey-haired person, male or female, tells me what to do. It's not accepted. And of course, we have tall poppy syndrome here in Australia. So there's the perception, we agree on what the behavior is this aggressive control and command, domineering, proud sort of behavior. But the way we interact with it is different, and it depends on the context. So every one of these behaviors has a place, and I'm not going to go through them all today, but just so that you've got a bit of an idea of what they look like. If I said the team were behaving like bees, what would I mean?
Collaborative, working together.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. One or two other words?
Hardworking.
Yep.
Busy.
Yep. So you can conjure this up, and that's how metaphor works. Actually language itself is a metaphor. Language is not, when I say a word, I don't mean the literal thing. I'm not giving you the literal thing. I'm describing it in a way that you understand from your context. And this is when you get a foreign word, you can't understand it because you don't know what it represents. So the behavior is the same. Each animal, and there is one plant, and there's a couple of made up animals deliberately. A really good example of this is the dragon. How the dragon is, everyone wants to be born in the year of the dragon, and they want their children to be born in the year of the dragon in China because it's the best of the 12, sort of Chinese zodiacs. The dragon is deeply respected. It's actually a collection of a bunch of other animals. So it's got, the body of the snake and the claws of the lion, etc. It's a combination of the best of the best. That's why people want it. So it's a really strongly respected thing. But if you look at, sort of Western stories, the dragon is the fierce animal who's stolen the princess and is, slain by the hero, on riding in on their white horse, and these stories are told to children so that they come to understand concepts and categorizations and the way society works. So, in Western culture, from birth, the dragon is the mean guy. But in Eastern culture, the dragon is the hero of the story. So you've got to be aware of these cultural differences. You say, oh, well, therefore the metaphor doesn't work, does it? But that's not true. It actually highlights those differences between the culture. And when you can have a co-creative conversation, you don't tell people how they should behave, you ask. So you give them a deck of cards, which is the full alphabet of characters, and you say, sort these out into layers. Which of these behaviors would be acceptable? You say, okay, you've entered an organization where you think there's a very high risk being taken. People are not wearing their safety gear, or the cleaning is not being done properly. There's a whole range of ways that you, as risk professionals, as managers and leaders generally, you go into organizations and you're sense making. You're making sense of, is this a good environment? Is it safe? Is it not safe? Why is that the case? You're reading not just the physical environment, but the behavioral environment. When you read the ad, it sounds great, but as soon as you walk in the door, you go, there's something wrong here. You can sense it. And behavior is the biggest risk in any workplace. You can have all of the best equipment in the world, but if people aren't using it properly, or the training hasn't been done properly, or people have a behavior where they sort of, go through and tick the box on the online training, but they don't try to understand it, then that behavior is going to come back and bite them. So something is going to go wrong. And then, of course, you're into the blame game, which is another behavior. So human beings are social creatures that interact with each other in an ecosystem. And what we're trying to do is to get them to exchange through cycles of conversation. And there's two things on this first slide that I've been sort of dancing around a little bit. The world is very different, in particular before and after COVID. Are we going to be tested, as Charles said, before we go in, before we travel? What kind of risk are you prepared to take? We all used to go to work and probably caught the flu and a cold and, whatever else was in the work environment. But now suddenly there's COVID, which still hasn't killed as much as the flu in any given year. No one's prepared to go to work anymore. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying it's a behavioral reaction to the circumstance, and the difference is really interesting. I'll show you the next slide. Well, just before I move on, what I'm really trying to encourage you to do is to engage in conversations around these things. So that little diagram there on the left that's still on the screen, the first thing in any effective conversation cycle is we acknowledge that we're going to differ with each other. And that's not a problem. If we acknowledge that we're going to have differences of opinion, then we can explore why those differences are there. And maybe I learn that you were right and I was wrong, or you learn that I was right and you were wrong, or we learn that actually, both of these things are completely acceptable. And there are other alternatives as well. There are always many alternatives. But if you have a closed mind to say that's not the right way, that's a behavior. Your behavior is rejecting the possibility of other options. And your mindset is actually creating a behavioral issue in its rejection. So you go around, if you acknowledge and then you respect others and then you inquire, you ask questions rather than tell, you then engage into a deep conversation to explore. It's divergent. You're going out, you're looking for other options rather than focusing in. That enables you to see alternatives in order to adapt, to become something different. We're all on a journey of becoming. We are becoming more capable. We are becoming, and without open-mindedness, we are becoming more stubborn and more set and more patterned in our ways. But if we turn it around to be open up our behavior and to explore other possibilities, then what we do is we become more capable and more adaptable, which enables us to collaborate, which gives us the ability to co-create. And if you get that behavioral environment right, it really is magic. And we can move from a fragile environment to an agile environment, one that is much more open. You know, first 4 weeks of COVID, very VUCA, very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Now that we're starting to come out the other side, we're a little bit risk averse. But what if? All of this is about behavior. If you understand your behavior and you understand how adaptable or controlled you need to be, you can actually make better decisions. Gavin, if I can go to the next slide, thanks. Any questions, any thoughts about that as we go through? No, that's okay. So let's keep going. Please interrupt at any time. That's not just a little theoretical model on that last slide. It's actually how I live my life. I really want to hear your differences of opinion, because that engages us in a. I'll go, oh, interesting. I didn't see it that way. Why do you see it like that way? And we keep asking each other questions, and there's an opportunity to learn from each other. It's actually where creativity comes from. Creativity is extremely low in organizations where everything is deeply controlled, because people don't want to get out of their comfort zone. So let's have a look at these two behavioral situations. What actually happened about 4 or 5 weeks into COVID is the Europeans did a great big collaborative activity where they announced they were going to combine all of the ventilators they had and share them. But Boris said that he didn't want any part of it. So even though they were going through Brexit, the European Union still tried to, invite the English, or the British, into a collaborative way of dealing with the problem. Now, when I wrote this some time ago, because I'm reusing this particular slide from something I did at the time with the Russians, I was highlighting that decision is going to come back and bite them. Look at what was going on in Germany, where this initiative started, the lowest level of fatalities per case in the world, compared to what's going on in Britain, one of the highest. So that's a behavioral activity. They're saying, oh, no, we're not part of them anymore. We don't want to be involved, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a rejection of that decision based on emotional response and relationship, both of which are behavioral based. And the history says it all. At the time that I presented this, both Australia and Russia had about 6,000 cases and 58 deaths. And I was talking to a bunch of people from different government departments in Russia. And I said, look, we're right at a moment. We were just starting to flatten and they were just starting to rise. I said, now is your moment. You need to be absolutely controlling in what you do. Right now, you need to adjust the behavior in the community, to go into lockdown, but they were rejecting it. If you look at the figures today, Australia is still on a very similar set of numbers. I think we're up to about 70 deaths and almost 7,000, whereas Russia have tripled since that time. And this is only in a few weeks. So the way in which we engage people to change their behavior on the decisions that need to be taken, we can either accept it or reject it. You look at what's going on in California, then, they're all complaining about not going back to work. Versus, they were very, very good in the beginning, but now they're over it and they want to go back to work. That is a huge risk for America right now. That is not a behavior that they can allow to happen. Otherwise, they're going to get a second wave, which is exactly what happened 102 years ago. During the flu pandemic, San Francisco was amazing. In the first wave of the flu epidemic, pandemic, it's funny they called it Spanish flu. It actually started in America, but nobody talked about it because during the war, everyone was being secret. But because Spain was independent, they were actually public about what was going on. Everyone thought it started in Spain, but it didn't. It actually started in the US and went across with the troops, which then spread it throughout Europe. And it actually helped to cut the war short because the American troops got infected as well. So, you know, it's all of this only came out later. But the point was that San Francisco were relatively unscathed because they said to their people, that's it, nobody's going out. They did social distancing. They locked everything down very well and got very, very few deaths during the first wave. They did everything brilliantly, just as we've done here in Australia, and really minimized the spread of the disease very quickly. But what happened, of course, is phase 2 killed more people than phase 1, particularly in San Francisco, because they were over it. And then they changed their behavior to say, no, look, you know, phase 1 didn't do any damage at all. There's no risk here. We can now do whatever we want to do. And then phase 2 came through and just about crippled the city. And there was a phase 3 as well. But you can see that the behavioral choices that people make have a huge impact on what's going on. And, you know, whether you're a risk auditor or you're a leader or a team manager, you've got to be constantly reading that behavioral environment and getting it to a level where people are actively and constructively engaging in conversations around the behavior. I put the collision there for a good reason. Most organizations really sort of fell apart, but within weeks of COVID, what happened was that the Collision Conference, which is a global conference that goes on, it's huge. They were online within weeks of the major thing. Any questions on that? I can talk about this all day without taking a breath, right? And I know that we don't have much more time. Gav, what time do you want to wrap up?
If we can sort of wrap up at about just before 1:45, this gives us enough time for commentary. One question I might ask around behaviours, and obviously it's a passion of mine, given my background, but there's one thing about having a conversation or exploring behaviours when you're seeing them in the workplace. We're now in a working from home environment, and so we don't necessarily have the greatest line of sight around how people are interacting. Have you got any thoughts around, you know, what cues or insights you can gather through, you know, conference calls and Zoom calls or team calls, whatever it might be, where you're not in the workplace, you're not necessarily seeing it all the time?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Gavin. It's a real challenge. I mean, right now, I'm facilitating a Masters of Project Management class. I just do a little bit of part-time teaching, just for fun and to have young minds to mess with, right? I mean, you know, young minds to curate and care for. We've got to get our words right. This class is mainly international students who are quite meek and mild, even in a classroom, let alone on a video conference. So we got 2 weeks in, and fortunately we had a couple of weeks face-to-face first to build the relationships. And when I was running virtual communities of practice in a multinational, even 10 years ago, we always would try to get at least some face-to-face so that people could build the relationships and get a bit of an understanding of each other before they had to go into video conference. But to build those relationships in a virtual environment takes so much longer. And in fact, just before this call, I was talking to a couple of people. We've got some facilitators working for breakout groups for the workshops next week. And I said, look, you call these couple of people before you do the call, you know, and just have a chat. Because, you know, you break the ice. It's really hard to do that in a VC. The more you can build the relationships face to face, the better. But when you don't get that opportunity, like now, You've really just got to do what you were doing at the beginning very well. Hey guys, how's it going? Share a story. What's happened this week. You really want to get the engagement. And why I keep saying to people, what do you think? What questions do you have? Like, there's stuff you want to share, but it's more powerful to get people talking about it if you can. You want to facilitate the environment rather than share content. So the more you can do that,
I jump in?
the better
It's
off.
Paul Bonello.
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. It's Paul Bonello here from WorkSafe. One of the biggest issues we've got at the moment is, as an organisation, we're in BAU working from home, but we've probably onboarded around 100 new staff in the last 6 weeks, and my team being one of them. Trying to onboard someone that's not physically in an office in a risk role where you have to engage with people is just exceptionally challenging. And a lot of the leadership teams where they've got new staff are saying this because we're trying to get people that are coming in to do a job, but they lose that person-to-person interaction. And it's hard enough to motivate people in a normal environment when they're trying to learn a new organisation and a new role, but keep them motivated to then perform. And it's really, really difficult.
Yeah, 100%, Paul. It was Paul, yes?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Sorry, your name is obscured by the thing here. It really is difficult. We will get better at it. It's the old, practice makes perfect. We never get perfect at relationships, but we can get better and better at them. Interacting, socially one-to-one more often, getting smaller teams and really encouraging people to engage in the conversations is really important. Like, one of the things I do with the students is I bring them all in, put them into breakout rooms, and they've got a list of the organizational Zoo character cards. And in their teams that they're working for real clients in their teams, I'll say, profile your client, which kind of animals do you see? Which ones do you not see? Which ones would be acceptable? So you give them like a semi-play environment, because in a play environment, you're into divergence of mindset, which then makes you more open to share. But building that sense of confidence and comfort zone sharing in the virtual environment really takes a lot of time and investment. And yes, you're right, it is hard, but it can be done. The other thing is explaining to them a little bit about, yes, it is different. And of course, we'd prefer to be in the room with you. But we don't have that opportunity because, the health risk is too high. So, asking them questions is a really powerful way to do it. So, how can I help you? What kind of challenges have you faced? Did anyone face a challenge and get around it by the use of the tools? Getting them involved in those kinds of conversations, the little circular conversation on the first slide, I find is really useful. There's a few other slides later on in this deck which we may or may not get to that could be quite helpful as well, Paul.
I might just add a little bit to that as well. What I find is I think sometimes the expectations on excellence is heightened in these environments. So people, because they're sitting at home, because they're sitting behind a computer, there's a potential for a heightened level of expectation, and so that can be either self-driven or potentially perceived by the organization. So that idea of play, or the idea of having a conversation where you can reduce some of those expectations, recognition that we're not going to get this perfectly right, potentially a sense of humility as well, and sharing the errors of your own experiences, I've always found to be quite helpful, particularly when new people are coming on and there is that potential for their concern. They don't know the environment well enough. But also I'm seeing that with organizations that are well entrenched, so teams that know each other particularly well, have worked together for long periods of time. What I'm hearing as well is still this heightened expectation or expectation of excellence, and so it's like they can't fail. So people are working longer hours and therefore potentially getting grumpier down the track. So I think at times we also need to forgive ourselves and give ourselves permission. We're not going to be 100% right, and it's okay to express that and discuss it because others potentially are feeling the same way.
That's a really, really good point. showing a little bit of vulnerability and saying, oh, look, whoops, I made the mistake there, or sometimes even when I know how one of the functions work, just to build the confidence of the students, I go, where's the record button, or where's the, who can, I've put you all into the wrong breakout rooms. Can you reorganize yourselves? Just, getting them to be more active rather than just, comfortably numb listening. That all makes a big difference. Yeah. Thanks, Gavin. Let's just have a look at this. People react in different ways. Behavior can be an absolute risk, or it can be an absolute fantastic thing. Who can tell me why there was an entirely different set of behavior? We had two major crises already this year. The so-called unprecedented bushfires, which, by the way, they weren't unprecedented. We just don't remember them because they're not in our living memory. But if you go back through the history, you can see we've had bigger and more nasty bushfires in the past. However, what happened with the bushfires, it was extremely collaborative. They couldn't deal with all of the, the money and stuff that was coming in to try and help out. Everyone wanted to help. And yet, when we went into the COVID crisis, only a couple of months later, in the same society, we had this panic buying and fighting in the supermarkets. What's the difference? Anyone?
I think the key thing, Arthur, is that in the second situation, it was impacting everybody, as opposed to people on the side seeing what was happening with the bushfires, saying, isn't that terrible? I'm glad it's not me, but I'll be generous and help out.
Yep.
Yeah, and aligned to Paul's point, it was personal risk in the second case rather than, watching it from afar as well.
Yeah, it's like, I look at these poor people, I'm not at risk. Maybe I should do something to help those that are. Imagine if that was me. They can imagine themselves being at risk and the importance of that. And that's a behavioral thing. It's an emotional tug to say, you know what, I'll give them something. And a lot of people were giving stuff that just couldn't be used or distributed, but they felt they were behaving in a way that actually made them feel a bit better about themselves by trying to help, as opposed to just sitting back and ignoring it. And yet, when they felt they were personally at risk, you couldn't buy a roll of toilet paper for, a month. And I mean, that's just a ridiculous response, right? You can sit back and the world was just laughing at us, and they say, well, hang on a minute, we've only just finished these bushfire stories where they're saying, look at how amazing the Australian people are and how collaborative and together they are. And, look at them now. They're punching each other up, over a roll of, dunny paper. You can see that huge contrast. But that perception of risk and that unknowing, when you know that your house isn't going to get burnt down versus when you don't know whether you're going to be able to feed your family in a week's time, then there's a huge difference in the way that you react to that. And most people in a crisis, when they are personally at risk, will go back to, sort of self-protection. And that's what we're seeing.
Arthur, is there and I know we are running short of time, but just an interesting insight though, we still have people in the bushfires who were at risk, their houses were burning down, and yet they were still wanting to be collaborative. And yet we might have scenarios now in the COVID environment where we might be safe in our own homes, so therefore not at risk, yet we still demonstrate the competitive behavior. Is there a time factor that is playing out here, that there is an unknown because of we don't know when the virus is going to disappear? It's also, we can't see it, so there's no visual representation, whereas with the fires, we could see them, we could almost understand how we can control it. And even though it was out of control for periods of time, there was the element of we will get this under control. Whereas at the moment now, there is no line of sight around whether we'll get it under control. If we'll ever get it under control, there may never be a vaccine that comes out, in which case, I read something the other day that said we could be dealing with this for the next 5 to 10 years on a cyclic basis, like the normal flu. Do you think time and control plays a role?
Yeah, it's really good. I feel quite competent to talk about this because my first 2 degrees were in microbiology, and my later ones are in behaviour. So the question is right up my alley. But yes, is the answer. Time makes a difference, but also degree of behavioral adaptability. How adaptable are you as a person? And this is a huge range for different people. If you're an extreme introvert and you don't like going outside, and you'll move away from conflict, you're going to react to this in a different way to an extrovert. Just as an extrovert usually hates video conferencing because they want to be face to face and feeding off the energy in the room, which they can't do in a video conference. So I find that the people who, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like that point. Can we train people to be more adaptable, more flexible in their mindset if we
100%.
identify it?
100% you can. And of course, it's harder with people who are more sort of set in their ways than with people who are just naturally more open. And you see this even in society. Some people will walk along the street and say g'day to everyone, but then other people, if you say g'day to them, it's almost like they shrink away and they're afraid to interact, and it's not that there's a right or wrong. And this is what we do with the organizational zoo. That's why there are 26 characters, and you start doing it by playing the other characters as a role play. We do a thing called behavioral improv, where we have the deck of cards, you turn over and you just got to start behaving in that particular character right there and then in the moment. And then when the next card's turned up, the next person has to come in, stay within the context of the conversation. But that behavioral improv is magical in that, when people feel they're role playing, it's not really them, they're just acting. They then get used to it. But what they get used to subconsciously is quickly stepping from one behavior to another to increase that adaptability, to see that it's not that scary stepping outside their comfort zone if the behavioral ecosystem is safe. Where it's unsafe to do that, if you're in a really toxic environment and you're being a little bit edgy and inconsistent as perceived by others, then you get stepped on pretty quickly. But if you can create the whole behavioral ecosystem to be more adaptable and to have adaptable elements within that, as in the individual people involved, that's a really magic thing. And that's done, I do that through play. So we play various games to do those different things. So I know that we're almost on time. We'll do one more slide, but yeah,
somebody
we've got
wanted to
someone
jump
coming in.
in
Julia?
Yeah, look, if you don't mind, I'm just back on that last slide. I've got something else going through my mind, which is a rather uglier element of human behaviour, in my view, that I toss on the table. In the Australian bushfires setting, it happened from nature and it happened to us. And there's a little bit about Australia that's really proud of, our national identity, about what we fight and what we deal with in our country, the harshness of our country. In the COVID-19 example, which is, as you pointed out there, which gave rise to some pretty nasty competitive behaviours, just a call out that came from China, that came from an outsider, that's a foreign incursion on myself, and it's a risk to me from others. And in fact, the Spanish flu, as you say, which was actually from Kansas, had very many of the same things. And in fact, we've even heard the Americans call COVID the Chinese thing. And I think that plays into this difference too. In Australia, we're so proud of how we cope with our harsh country, but anything that comes to us from an Asian or another country that is of danger to us brings out some pretty ordinary behaviours.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And this is where, your behavioural adaptability is so important. You find the kinds of people that, do the racism, the name calling, the judgment type of characteristics, tend to be those who have a fairly narrow range. And my team is right, and anyone that doesn't agree with me is wrong. And they'll find, language and actions and behaviors that include or exclude. You're either one of us or you're one of them. And this is something that we can break down in society, but it takes a lot of work, and that's actually quite. I'm doing a lot of that with Russian clients at the moment, with building collaborative communities that go across organisations that would normally compete, and it's actually working quite well. But that's a bigger story for another time, perhaps, because I know that I think Gavin.
So one you want to finish on?
Yeah, this is all interesting stuff. This I wrote a LinkedIn post about recently, so you can have a look at it there. If you can just skip through, there's one with like a football team and a basketball team. Stay there, but the one before that was that mind map was a structure called Conversations That Matter. There's also something on the Organizational Zoo blog website there. It's not a commercial site. Everything is free, so I'm not selling here. I'm sharing. Have a look at that. There's a blog post on that from several years ago. But I'll just spend 2 minutes using this one to wrap up, and then we can either take questions or hand back to you, Gavin.
Sure.
I talk about behavioural adaptability and ecosystems. The most powerful teams, the most powerful organisations, communities are ones with a diversity of behaviour, but the diversity of behaviour is adapted to the environment that they're in. So if you look at a basketball team, theoretically, it's a non-contact sport. I used to play and coach, so I know that you can still be flattened on the floor, but far less so in that than something like a rugby type football. If you look at that, the basketball team, there's a diversity of behaviour, and normally if you had more time, I'd say, what part of your organisation would that be? And people say things like, sort of HR or creativity or R&D, and it's all the softly, rah, we're all in it together type behaviours. But on the other side, you can see that, the types of behaviours, these are all characters in the zoo, by the way, the types of behaviours that you're seeing are much more aggressive. But here, they're a highly competitive team, but they're collaborative within the team. So they can work together, but together they become very aggressive against the competition. And here, this represents your sales team, your logistics team, the manufacturing, this type of thing, your legal team, if you're fighting, a legal battle against someone else. Your risk auditor's got to have elements of this, right? But then if they want to get a collaborative response to the risk audit report where they need to change, they probably need to use some of the basketball type behaviors. So you just imagine if your HR, creativity team is over here in the basketball, and then your sales and your auditors are over there in the left. It's a magic team, right? But imagine it the other way around. Imagine if your creativity team was like the football team, and your risk assessors and your sales were on the other side. It just doesn't work. It's not about right or wrong. It's about making sure that you're adaptable enough in your behavior to suit the context, and you can shift from one to the other as your contexts shift. So I'm going to shut up now because like I said, I'm passionate about this. I know that it's really useful to you. I hope you play with it, and I'm happy to answer questions. You can send me an email if you want, but please think about this and how you can be adaptable and align the behavior to the context. Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you so much. I really do like the concept of that adaptability and how we are adapting our behaviors now, and also picking up on potential behaviors that when people are struggling, and what sort of behaviors are they demonstrating, and how we're, for those that are leaders and have leadership roles or supervisory type roles, how we're picking up on that. So thank you very much. If there's any other questions or any thoughts or comments, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up, and I'll give you a bit of an insight as to what's coming next week, because we have another guest joining us next week. But any other thoughts, comments?
Just one more comment,
Sure.
Gavin, relating to behaviour. Thank you very much for the people who interrupted. That was fantastic. As you see, that when you started to bring other voices into the conversation, it made it more interesting for everyone. And it's not that any one particular person is boring, but actually a conversation like a conversation, over drinks on Friday night, when you used to be able to do that at the pub, you bounce around and bounce off each other. And the more you can get used to that sort of behavior in this environment, the more valuable these interactions will become for you. Keep interrupting. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, guys? No? Cool. Well, Arthur, again, thank you so much for joining. As always, we will share all the information and stuff, and we'll put up the links to your information there, Arthur, and I really appreciate you joining us today. For everybody else, next week, we're having, it's not that I've got this theme of academia, but we do have another academic joining us next week. His name's Dr. John Hopkins, not named after the think tank over in the US, but his area of interest and expertise focuses on logistics, and initially started off in the transport space, looking at how cars are moving through traffic congestion through cities and the like, shifted into logistics and supply chain, and now it's focusing on telehealth, teleworking, and the like in his research at the moment. So he's going to join us next week to share some of his thoughts and insights around what he's seeing in the world. So should be another fascinating conversation next week, and hopefully you guys can join us. But if there's nothing else, or if anything, if Craig or Brooke wants to add anything to it, if there's any other final comments, we'll call it quits a couple of minutes early.
All good. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll chat next week.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Gavin.
all.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks,
Thanks,
Al.
all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you guys.
All right. How do I get the screen back? Oh, Arthur, you still there? No, I think he's gone. Brooke, you still there? Anyone still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Ah, cool. Thanks, mate. Have a good week.
Yeah, you too. That slide deck of Arthur's, do we put that on our site, or does it need to not go there because it's
No.
his
He's
stuff?
happy for it. He's happy for us to share it.
Okay.
I sent it to you, I think.
Yeah, I've saved it. I just didn't know whether to upload it yet, so I've sort of
Yeah,
asked
he's
first.
actually sent it as a PDF.
Yep, so that's saved. I'll just put that on the website, and then we'll send the link out to it Monday morning.
Sweet. All right, I'll send the PDF to you now as well.
Didn't you already send it?
I sent you the slide deck. He sent it to me as a PDF as well, so we can put that onto the website as its own PDF.
Perfect. Easy.
Either way, it's all there. You got it.
Okay.
All right, mate. Have a good weekend. We'll chat Monday.
Done. You too.
All right. Good night. See ya.